Thank you for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here. I am really going out on a limb today to speculate historically on whether or not the Jews killed Christ, whether we killed Jesus back in his time. Now, I am not getting into this issue to in any way question or in any way at all denigrate Jesus as the Messiah. That's not my purpose. That is a Christian question. I don't see that as really any of my business. I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment on such a thing. And furthermore, I believe that Jesus' ministry was certainly messianic. I mean, I would urge Christians to believe in Jesus. I think that the ministry of Jesus has resulted in the greatest advancement of human civilization ever, both in terms of personal belief for individuals who find salvation and find themselves in a sense of morality, and also for societies. I mean, I don't think the United States would have been possible without the ministry of Jesus. So I admire Jesus and I admire that ministry, and I hope that it strengthens itself in every sense, both as individuals and as a civilization. And I think that if you look at it objectively, you'd have to almost conclude that Jesus certainly was at least messianic, in that his ministry has brought such advancement and such values to the world. But I'm not here to comment on that. I am here to comment on whether or not the Jews killed Jesus, which is something that I do feel entitled to talk about as a Jew. And first of all, we'll never know for sure because this happened in ancient times. And we can only go by the testimony of those who were there or those who had firsthand or even secondhand knowledge of the situation. And it's my understanding that the three Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, that actually deal with the life of Jesus and that were written at a time reasonably close to Jesus' death, that they don't make that claim. That claim was first lodged by this mysterious fellow, and again, I'm not denigrating here, but who was known as Saul of Tarsus, who was known to Christians as Paul the Evangelist, and his letters, his epistles. It was Paul who originally said that the Jews killed Christ. I mean, I think that it was Paul in one of his letters, I'm not sure which, I think to Galatians, said that the Jews killed Christ. Now, Saul of Tarsus did not know Jesus. He was not there at the time. He came along later. I don't know exactly how much later. I think maybe 50 years later, 30 years later. He did know St. James, and St. James was the inheritor of Jesus. After Jesus was killed, it was James who became the head of the church for about 30 years. And by the way, James was a devout Jew. And it was James who had the argument with Paul, who wanted to proselytize to the world, about whether or not he should proselytize to non-Jews, which actually says a lot about Jesus' ministry. But that kind of puts Paul at maybe 10, 15 years after the crucifixion, and since he was Saul of Tarsus, he doesn't appear to have been there, because Tarsus is a region that's up in the northern part of the Mediterranean near Antioch. It's in today's Turkey. So we can't really place Paul at the scene, either literally or even in the vicinity. And so then who did kill Jesus? We don't, again, it's not exactly there to tie the Jews into it. But what we do know from the Gospels, all of them agree, and I think from history, is that Jesus was killed by the Romans. Jesus was killed by a direct order from the Roman governor of Judea. Pontius Pilate. The actual executioners of Jesus were Romans. He was arrested by the Romans. He was hung on the cross by the Romans. And that at that particular time, the Romans were executing or crucifying people left and right. I mean, they didn't really make bones about that. I mean, there were executions all the time in Judea and probably elsewhere in the Roman Empire, because that's how the Romans meted out punishment. Now, why did the Romans want to kill Jesus? First of all, the Romans were tolerant toward Judaism and toward all of the other religions of their realm. Generally, they viewed them as fine as long as people respected the government of Rome, the emperor. They didn't generally interfere with religions. They had a particularly suspicious feeling about Judaism because we didn't worship a god, that they could see. The Romans were very visual. We didn't have an idol. And so they called us atheist. In fact, the word atheist was the word that the Romans in Latin actually used to describe the Jews. Because since they couldn't see our God, we didn't have a statue, we didn't have like a physical representation, they didn't believe that we worshiped God. They didn't think we believed in any God. They couldn't conceive of the idea of a God in heaven, of a creator of the universe that's beyond human perception. And so, but yet even then, they still grandfathered it in. They accepted the fact that we would worship, and they didn't interfere with Jewish worship, except if Jews, or for that matter anyone else in any of their realm, seemed to threaten the government, seemed to threaten the social order that the Romans were trying to establish. And even in the days of Jesus, the Romans had not yet completely developed their emperor worship, because the emperor system was still quite new. I think that Jesus was born at the same time as Julius Caesar's reign, and then Augustus Caesar, who was his adopted son and nephew, then became the great emperor Octavian Augustus, and he's the one that really implemented the idea of worship of the emperor. But I think that he came actually later. He came maybe during Jesus' lifetime, maybe shortly after Jesus, but the whole idea of the emperor worship was still something that was relatively new to the Roman Empire at that time. But nevertheless, the Romans were interested in peace, they were interested in order, they were interested in observing the law, and they would execute anyone that they thought might threaten that law. That's probably how they perceived Jesus. I mean, after all, Jesus was claiming to be the king of the Jews. At least that's what they saw him as. In fact, the little inscription on the cross, Imri, I-M-R-I, stands for "Here hangs the King of the Jews." It was meant to mock Jesus. That look at him, he's the King of the Jews, and yet now he's dead. And that would be a Roman thing. I mean, the idea that he would rise up as a political figure to challenge the Roman Empire, they would execute someone like that in a second. They would have no problem. And that very well may be how they perceive Jesus. Now, it's been said by some theoreticians, and again, we don't know this, that the whole scene in the Garden of Gethsemane just before Jesus was arrested was not exactly one which Jesus was walking quietly and speaking to God and meditating. But in fact, it was an insurrection, because there is a line in the book of Matthew that says, put away your swords, put back your swords. The war is over. Why did they have swords out? Were they fighting? It's very possible that was an attempt to take the temple, to seize Jerusalem. And as such, the Romans stopped it and they arrested Jesus. And within hours, he was crucified. And also that Jesus's group had a spy. within its ranks. That was Judas Iscariot. Judas turned Jesus over to the Roman authorities by basically exposing this conspiracy according to Roman standards, which would have been an insurrection, and it did so for the famous 30 pieces of silver. And thus, he identified Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane with a kiss, and then the Romans arrested him. Now, Judas was no more or no less a Jew than Jesus was. I mean, he was one of Jesus's disciples. It's not really fair to say, oh, well, he was the Jew. It's like, sort of they single him out when they were all Jews. I mean, the whole affair was a Jewish affair. I mean, he was not loyal to Jesus. He was a traitor to Jesus. But, he was a disciple of Jesus. He was not part of the mainstream Jewish establishment at that time. He was a disciple of Jesus who turned him over to the Romans. So, there's no evidence that the Jews had, the Jewish establishment, that is, had anything to do with that. I also will just, and again, these are just my thoughts on the topic. I feel compelled to discuss it because as a Jew, I want to maybe open the lens a little bit to this idea that the Jews killed Jesus and thus killed Christ. This is the basic premise of Dr. E. Michael Jones's book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, that since the Jews killed Christ, we're in rebellion against Logos. And I just think that it's worth questioning, well, did we kill Christ? Did we kill Jesus? In our lifetime in the province of Judea, most Jews didn't recognize Jesus as the Christ. But did they kill him? Did they arrange for his execution? I'm not so sure. I mean, I think we need to do a deeper dive on that issue, and I will do that as I further my studies on the topic. But I just want to conclude by also noting that the Talmud has come under great assault and always has been controversial by a lot of people that are Christian thinkers. Certainly E. Michael Jones has, whom I respect greatly, but some other people have who I'm not so respectful toward. I'm not going to mention names, but they're all over the internet, and they're talking about the Talmud as being some kind of a satanic text, and that it says nasty things about Jesus, which, by the way, I'm not sure it does either. I mean, that's another thing I'm examining. But what I'll say is that because of a quote that Dr. Michael Jones sent me, coming from the book of Matthew, to bolster one of his arguments, I took the opportunity to read in the book of Matthew and to do a little bit more reading in the Gospels, and probably will be doing more as time goes on. And what it has made me realize, at least, or think, I don't know if I realize this, but it's a theory, is that Jesus was a Talmudist. He was at least well versed in the Talmud, if not a Talmudic scholar who was debating other Talmudists, who back then were called Pharisees. The Talmud was very much around. It wasn't written down yet. It didn't get written down, and it's an interesting story how that happened. But eventually it would be written down hundreds of years later. But the Talmudic methods of the Pharisees were very much alive and well in Jesus' lifetime. They, conventional wisdom puts them many, many hundreds of years before Jesus, going back to the days of the Greeks and the Maccabees, and even before that, going back to Ezra and the reestablishment of the Jewish Commonwealth. And Jewish tradition, Jewish faith, Jewish rabbinic ideas trace the Talmud back to Moses. That's another subject. That's a theological question. I personally think that there is evidence of that. Why not? The Talmud is nothing more than law, an interpretation of law, and administration. But the fact that Jesus was debating high-level Pharisees tells me that Jesus was himself a high-level Pharisee, and that the methods of communication between Jesus and the Pharisees is very Talmudic in its nature. And his criticism of the Pharisees, at least those whom he was dealing with, are very apt, very much within the tradition of the Talmud. They're the same criticism I lodge today at the Jewish establishment, as they call the Federation, that they're not believers, that they've taken on the trappings in many cases of Judaism and of belief. They carry themselves off with intricate knowledge of every little tiny, custom and tradition, and they observe the holidays right down to the letter, where they even have to have their bottle of water have a kosher symbol on it. And and yet they don't believe. They don't have faith. They don't have anything going on inside. It's all window dressing. That is Jesus' main criticism of the Pharisees that he was dealing with, and I think he was right on, by the way. But I'm just pointing out that criticism is a legitimate Talmudic debate that occurs to this day in the Jewish community. And the same thing could be said, by the way, of Christians, right? I mean, they'll take on the trappings. For some reason, what comes to my mind is Bill Clinton on his way to church on Sunday, wearing his Sunday clothes and carrying his Bible and waving it defiantly at the media as they take pictures of him, going into the church, looking very reverent. And then, of course, we know that maybe a few hours later, he's in the White House having a dalliance with his girlfriend, Monica Lewinsky. So, I mean, how much of a Christian was he? That's up to God to know. I'm not making any claims on that regard. I'm simply pointing out that is a criticism. My criticism of him would be the same as the criticism that Jesus had for the Pharisees, and that we all have for people who pose as people of faith when in fact they're corrupt, and that they're not at all. So the dialogue that took place between Jesus and his whole method of speaking, and the parables and the Sermon on the Mount, these things are very Talmudic if you look at it. And I think there's evidence that he was very well versed in the Talmudic way of thinking, and that Jesus was a very devout Jew, and he was viewed as such by his fellow Jews at the time, even if they didn't agree with his messiahship. I mean, the fact that they would even touch him, let alone have him executed, I think that it raises some questions. I mean, it doesn't seem to be likely in retrospect. So those are my thoughts on the subject. I know that I'm wading into controversy, but that's why I do this show. You're certainly welcome to respond. Please subscribe to my channel. And thanks for watching, everybody.